Knowing that I have constructed the test so heavily in relation to my, not only what's in the textbook, but in relation to my lectures, I've got to finish this. I intend to do it. Here we go. I gave you a very brief and superficial explanation of how it is that in British North America, the southern colonies in particular made a transition to the use of slave labor, and it happened in the 1700s. And the simple truth is that by 1780, slavery had become deeply rooted as the dominant labor system of the South in the colonies stretching from Georgia up to Virginia, including Maryland. There were slaves also being used in some of the northern states to a degree, but not to the same degree. And it was, to me, in my view, there was an element of racism associated with it, but it was largely economics. The folks who had the means, those planters who had the wealth to buy slaves, opted for slave labor because it gave them permanent, and from their point of view, permanent, and that means permanent means forever, control over their labor supply. The labor supply they could control without limitation because they had no rights. Now, we're talking about the developments in the colonies in the 1700s. The 1700s, not the 1600s. I'm not going to ask you a bunch of questions about specific dates. I want you to be able to distinguish between the 1600s and events that took place then and trends of that time versus the 1700s. In the 1600s, the population, the settler population of the colonies grew rapidly. Ultimately, the number of people, settlers, English-based, living in this stretch of territory grew significantly from day one, which is 1607, to 1700. What happened in the 1700s? Continued rapid growth. It's very rapid growth. By 1775, and the significance of that is, by that time the Americans would feel so confident that they're ready to launch a revolution against Great Britain. By that time, there are 2.5 million colonists. So it goes from 250,000 to 2.5 million in this 75-year stretch. So obviously there was rapid population growth. And it comes from two sources. One's going to come from natural population growth of people having babies, and one's going to come from new kinds of people coming in. Now here, population growth trends in the 1700s changed compared to the 1600s. Now, try to remember, I told you that in the southern colonies, in the Chesapeake region in particular, in the 1600s, that area was characterized by low life expectancy, high rates of death, high rates of disease, small families, a lot of splintered families because of the death of a spouse. What happened in the 1700s? Did it stay that way? And the answer is no. At some point, decades into the 1700s, those kind of negative trends of the southern colonies faded away and were replaced by more normal trends of more normal life expectancy into your 40s and 50s, and a more favorable ratio between men and women, a more even ratio, so there were more partners to marry, therefore more marriages and longer marriages, and then more children. Yes, all those things happened. And the result is going to be that the southern states began to register population growth in the 1700s. Now you could ask why, what changed, and I'm just going to tell you. How is it that a group of people who are dying at the age of 40 in 1650, by 1750, they are living a normal lifespan, normal for the time? Why did the sex ratio, the number of men versus the number of women, move towards greater equality? Here's what happened in terms of why are people living longer in 1750 if you live in if you live in Virginia, for example. Well, let's assume that there was a process whereby over the generations, the people who survived, the people who didn't die from malaria, had more babies. Basically, in some sense, those folks who survived and were not vulnerable to dying to the diseases that were present there, they lived and they had more babies, and their babies had some resistance to those diseases. It's almost like a bacterium today will acquire resistance to some kind of medicine designed to kill the bacteria. It's practically a form of evolution. We have to assume that happened. The disease environment became less disease-ridden because the people cleaned things up. The swamps were drained. The fields were put under agriculture. In other words, the habitat for the mosquito was reduced. Yeah. And here's a critical thing. You know what? As indentured servants stopped being the majority of the population, those young men living a rough life, being worked hard, they stopped being the norm. They stopped being the majority. The hardest work starts to be done by slaves, to tell you the truth, to be frank. The hardest work starts to be done by slaves. And since most indentured servants had to be men, the need to bring in a bunch of male immigrants goes away too. You're just going to see a situation where the white population begins to even out in terms of a sex ratio. Now, what was happening in the northern colonies in the 1700s in terms of population growth? They were still growing rapidly. Having a lot of babies in a relatively healthy environment, the population of the middle states like Pennsylvania and New York was growing, and the population of New England was growing also. It continued to grow. We talked about the very large families of the New England Puritan culture. Sometime after the 1750s, there in this area here, that's New England, there started to be so much population growth that there was too much population growth. The place became impacted. In other words, they've got too many people in relation to the land that's available for the people to be on and support themselves. When you continue to have generation after generation, every single child is going to be part of a household as they spread out. Of 6 to 8 kids, 6 to 8, 6 to 8, 6 to 8, 6 to 8, more kids, 6 to 8, 6 to 8, 6 to 8, 6 to 8. Just imagine what happened. It's almost unbelievable. And this ultimately started to create a crisis. Now, let me explain it quickly. See those fancy words? You don't have to write them down. I won't ask a question about primogeniture, and that's what that means. That's how you pronounce that. And I will not ask a question about partible inheritance. I'm just telling you something about human behavior. Listen, when a household acquires some property or some wealth, and I earnestly hope that all of you will create households that are able to acquire some wealth for you and your offspring and your future descendants. There's only a couple of ways for the current generation that has accumulated that wealth to pass it on to the next generation. There's only a couple of ways. And here are two of them. Primogeniture means that the old man passes all he's got onto his oldest son. What's the purpose of that? To keep the holdings together. We're talking about land here. We're not talking about cash money. That's for a group of people who don't want to see their estates busted up. You understand what I'm saying? And that form of transferring land was widely practiced among the people living in the southern colonies. And it was a practice in England. Partible inheritance means that you are taking you're leaving a will that says, I'm going to leave some land to all my kids, my sons. See how women are, in all of these circumstances, the women are kind of ignored. The women are seen as like property that's going to be transferred, transferable property. Ain't that something? Yeah. They're going to be, the woman will be taken on by another household and become part of that household. She's gone. What if there are no offspring but women? There's a problem. That changes things. But all these things favor the male offspring. So the partible inheritance, a Puritan father is saying, I've got 4 sons and 3 daughters. We're going to marry those daughters off. I got 4 sons. I'm going to give every one of my sons a certain amount of land upon my death or upon his maturity, so that he'll have a stake in life and a foundation for his own family. That's partible inheritance. The Puritans, this is the widely practiced in New England. Now you just think, when you continue to do that, generation after generation, you have all these sons, and you split up these lands, you're going to finally wind up with if you start off with a fairly decent sized piece of property, eventually it's going to be nothing left. You understand what I'm saying? Here's a piece of information from the kind of research that historians do. Typical land holding in Puritan New England was 250 acres for a household at one point. Then 100 years later, it's down to 80 acres. At some point, that's going to be cut to such a small piece that it really, given the way they cultivated food and depleted the soil, you're not going to have enough land to sustain a family. That's the situation New England was reaching by the 1760s, 1770s. It's like a crisis. In other words, it is a crisis when one group of people are accustomed to certain expectations about a standard of living. And their expectation was, I'm going to be a godly man and raise a family on the order of my people, following the customs of my people. And when a society reaches the point where they can no longer do that, there's no land for you, sonny. You're not going to be able to do that. You can't be like daddy. It is a crisis. It is a crisis. This new generation is looking at a situation where they can't live as well as the previous generation. That's the ultimate kind of crisis. And you know what? The United States is kind of facing that crisis right now in some people's minds. And we don't know if it's real or imaginary. That's why there's such incredible, bitter political conflict in this country right now. Are the best days of America over? Is the American dream gone? America is the land of opportunity. Is that a fraud now? There are only low-wage, minimum wage jobs left in America? That's why there's a bitter debate about this stuff. Well, there was back then, too. And some cultures and some circumstances in past history, a group of people, they have certain cultural traits and religious beliefs. And if for example, those beliefs say you will have as many children as possible. You'll continue to do that. If those religious impulses are so strong, you'll continue to do that. Even if it impoverishes your society, continue to do it. Some societies will continue those trends, and some others will some will not. Some will reject them, abandon them, or revise them. What these people do? Well, eventually the Puritans changed what they did. How'd they respond? They give up partible inheritance because they didn't want to see their lands disintegrate into little tiny postage stamp pieces of property. And then you have what happens to the young sons who are going to be landless? They are not going to be able to live according to the Puritan model. They leave because they could leave. They're going to go elsewhere where there's more land. This begins a kind of process of out-migration, going west, going west, going west, going west. There's an element to that. There's a reason why across the United States you can see Salem, Massachusetts, Salem, Oregon. There's a reason for that. Another way the colonies was through immigration, not having babies, but people coming in. And I want you to understand, in the 1600s there was some diversity to the immigration. Let me make a quick point. In the 1700s, you have non-English kinds of people coming into the colonies from Europe. Now, I'm going to tell you one more time, since many of my students may not have registered this point clearly. These are the British Isles, ladies and gentlemen. They're like this. That's a very simple little map. These are the British Isles. This is England. This is where the people who settled the colonies from Georgia to New England came from. England. And so in the 1700s, you did start to see an influx of immigrants coming from this area right here, which is ethnically and linguistically and culturally very distinct. They're white. A lot of them have red hair, as a matter of fact. But they hate the English with everything they got. And then some will be coming from this little corner of Ireland. Not a bunch of Irish, pure Irish, but some Scotch Irish. What's that movie? Braveheart. So there's Mel Gibson when he was still popular. That was a movie all about Scottish nationalism, William Wallace. and the hatred of the long-standing hatred of the Scottish for the oppressive English. So that, I'm just saying, it's a very separate ethnic identity. And the Irish, boy, do they have a separate identity, and you see that illustrated and projected in many different ways. We're talking about different groups of people. Simple truth is, you have a movement of some Scots, not too many, a significant influx of the so-called Scotch-Irish. I will say that there were some thousands of French Protestants called Huguenots. French Protestants. France had become a majority Catholic society. The Protestants there suffered from occasional persecution, so they begin to filter in. Not to a large degree, and they haven't left a great big implant. But the Scotch-Irish are people from Scotland, Protestants, who were encouraged to colonize, basically, and take over landholdings in this little corner of Ireland. And they come to be known as the Scotch-Irish. They're there today. They are Protestants. Your typical Irish person is a Catholic, deeply rooted in Roman Catholicism. The Scotch-Irish are not. This area today is still known as Northern Ireland, and it's still part of the United Kingdom, as opposed to Ireland, which is a free and independent republic. So the roots of Northern Ireland go way, way back when it was colonized by these so-called Scotch-Irish. They started to come over to the American colonies in very significant numbers. And they filtered into areas along they went all over the place, but they especially began to go into areas in the interior along the kind of foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. All from Pennsylvania all the way down to the end of the Appalachians. And they have left a there may be some people of Scotch-Irish descent in this room, and you probably may not even know it, and some of you probably never heard the term before. People like Andrew Jackson, he was Scotch-Irish. People like Davy Crockett, he was Scotch-Irish. It's generally understood that some of that kind of southern drawl that's present, well, these are the people who make up Appalachia. They're Scotch-Irish. They brought with them their musical custom that had developed in Northern Ireland, kind of Irish, Scottish, English combined together, string instruments, a style of singing, and that's the basis of American country music today. The styling, the musical style we associate with American country music is absolutely rooted in the Scotch-Irish tradition. You can hear it in the vocal styles of somebody like Taylor Swift. I wonder if she knows where she inherited some of those traditions. Now, a bunch of Germans came in as well. There were German-speaking provinces of Europe. Many of them Protestants. They're mostly coming for economic reasons, but some having some difficulty because of their religious beliefs. And this is when you start to see the arrival of the Amish. And you start to see the arrival of other religious sects, German-speaking religious sects like the Dunkers and the Moravians. And the Amish initially have their big impact in Pennsylvania. And their ancestors are with us today, very much so. And then it has to be said, what's the largest group of people who come into the British American colonies? Slaves, absolutely. I told you, 500,000. It's unbelievable. A stunning transformation within a couple of generations. Okay, we're done with that. This is all very simple. What happened to the colonial economy in the 1700s? Well, in the 1600s, what'd you have? Subsistence agriculture, largely in New England, plantation agriculture in the South. What happens in the 1700s? Well, the South expanded significantly. It expands the amount of land under cultivation. It makes the transition to slavery. There's a lot of expansion. It continues to be heavily agricultural. Heavily agricultural. That is, they're producing cash crops for sale, for export. And there are problems with that. They produced a lot of wealth. Virginia was the most significant and wealthiest and most populous colony, but it also has problems. I just want to tell you, there's a problem with an all-ag economy. They lack diversification. They're heavily dependent on prices of crops like tobacco and rice. And if those prices go up and down. So in good times, when the prices are good, the economy will be prosperous. And when the prices collapse, when you have an economy based on a stool that has just one leg, you can see the problem of a lack of diversification. This also becomes a feature of Southern society. They relied on their services like merchant services, shipping, insurance, distribution, banking, on Yankees, on Northerners, or British. They didn't develop their own cities and ports with a large component of people carrying out these functions. So they're not going to have a manufacturing sector where they're making ships and making rope and making sails and all that kind of stuff. If they do, it's very limited. Yes, it was wealthy. Now I'm just going to tell. It's all very simple. The North was more diversified. From Pennsylvania northward, it was more diversified. They had commercial agriculture. Yes, Pennsylvania had a lot. Grew wheat and corn. So did New York. But they also had this map shows you the different kind of activities of ironworks, distilleries, shipbuilding, lumber and timber. Yes, a more spread out economy with different kinds of activity, more non-agricultural activity. And I'll just tell you, in particular, New England, as we get into the 1700s, especially its economy began to move away from a heavy reliance on agriculture. New England developed the largest group of people not working in agriculture because New England had to. New England had to develop. If you're going to have people with something to do, with a job, with a way to make a living, New England had to move away from agriculture because New England was the place that supported agriculture the most poorly. That is to say, there just isn't that much soil there. There isn't that much good soil. There's not that much plantable soil. New England is that way. They also have a very short growing season. A New England farmer could in no way compete in productivity with a Pennsylvania farmer. Land, soil, and climate problems in New England forced people into other kinds of activities like fishing and shipbuilding and so forth. I'm here to tell you. I mean, there's a reason. When you go to New England, many of you haven't been there. Someday maybe you will. Go to a New England state. Go onto the countryside. You'll see rocky soil. Yeah, you'll see these fields separated by these little stone walls. Those are rocks they picked out of the ground. So now I've got to move. In the 1700s, was America still a place where a poor white man, could come from England and move up? In some sense, America, the British American colonies, had acquired this reputation as the best poor man's country. And that reputation came in the 1600s, when there was land for the taking, kinda, more or less. Was that still true in the 1700s? Pretty much, because some fundamental factors made the British American colonies different from, I believe, just about anywhere else on earth. And here are the two kings. There was an abundant amount of land. And the native population, wherever they possessed it, wherever they made claims to it, their claims were never seen as legitimate, and they're always going to be pushed off it. As the settler population expands westward, the natives will be dispossessed. That's all there is to it. So there was land. Land nobody really claimed, to a degree not present in Europe, not present in China, anywhere else I can think of. That's the most important thing. And then there was this happening too. Yes, there was a bunch of land, and nobody owned it. In Europe, throughout Europe, there were always noble lords and the descendants of aristocrats who owned most of the land. Even England, most of the people farming on the land in England were tenants working on somebody else's land. There was no hereditary landed aristocracy in the British American colonies because the aristocrats stayed at home where they were on top. When you're on top at home, why should you go to a place where there's hardship? The remarkable thing about British North America, and that means America, is that if you were not a slave, and if you're not a Native American, most households owned land. It developed from the earliest days as a society of landowners, or the people seeking to get land who often could. That separated America from most places on earth. Most places on earth. Now, having said all of that, I will tell you, in the 1700s, both in the North and the South, you started to see elites emerge. And that means a group of people clustered on top who have most of the power and wealth, and they're going to stay there. Yes, that happened. In the South, who are we talking about? We're talking about a landowning aristocracy. They're not true aristocrats. They're not born with noble blood, but they acquire a bunch of wealth and they keep it. Who are those people? Well, they were the planters. They were the plantation owners. That's a fancy word for plantation owners. Yes, by the 1700s, clearly, the southern colonies were not a place where there was a lot of social movement up and down. A group of people had come in and acquired great, highly valuable property, and they're able to pass it on to their kids. Yes, that's the case. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. See this guy right here? That is a fancy portrait of a guy who's all dressed up and sees himself as an English, practically an English nobleman, but he's not. He was an American-born colonist. That is Robert King Carter. And that's what he owned upon his death. 300,000 acres of land in Virginia. 734 slaves. I can't tell you what an immense number that is. It's just stunning. All that livestock, that would have to make him a billionaire by the standards of the time. That's got to make him the richest man in the British Empire, in my opinion. See? Having all that stuff, he's better than you are. He's Robert King Carter, the King of Virginia. So he's the kind of person I'm talking about. He was an American, born in the American colonies. Here's another one. Look at him. Educated in England. That's Mr. William Byrd II. He owned the land that became Richmond. So a group of people was reaching this level. A study was done looking at the wealthiest Virginia families in the 1780s. It was a PhD thesis. Trying to figure out, looking at the top 100, how many of those people, the question was, how many of the top 100 made their own money? In other words, came to the top through social mobility in their own lifetime. And almost none of them did. All of them were living on inherited money by that time. And if you looked at the top 100 Virginia fortunes of that group, the 1780s, you'd see these family names repeated again and again and again. These are the famous old family names of Virginia. Byrd, Fitzhugh, Washington, Lee, Conk, Harrison, the Randolphs of Virginia, the Carters. Lee is a big name. Even today, 2-3 centuries later, people who are distant relatives of these old kind of well-established, well-known Southern families still feel a little twinge of pride because of their connection to that kind of almost noble blood. The Southerners have a feeling about this much more so than in most other parts of the country. And many of you are not aware of this because you're just not familiar with these old-time American customs, the prestige of being related to one of those old Southern families. I got a dose of that when my wife received something in the mail from Jacqueline Lee. This is unsolicited mail sent to my wife. My wife's named Lily Lee. She's part of the Lee clan. So they said she got this letter. Dear Lily Lee, I have exciting news for you and fellow Lees. You can buy the World Book of Lees, and it's all about various Lees, including the very first Lee was Christopher. He came in 723. Blah, 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 blah. You, Lily Lee, are listening to this session. See, the funny thing about this is that my wife is Chinese. She is not one of these Lees. She's not one of those guys at all. They picked up the wrong group of Lees. They just said group mailing to every Lee they could find. But still, that shows you something about their pride in that connection. Now I'm going to show you a few scenes from one of these old family estates. This tree-lined road in southern Maryland leads to the Sotterley Plantation outside of Hollywood, Maryland, along the Chesapeake Bay. The house you see here is a mansion built on the estate that finally came into the hands of the Plater family in the early 1700s. Beautiful grounds overlook the Patuxent River that leads into the Chesapeake Bay. Everything you see here is an indication of the kind of wealth that was accumulated by Chesapeake planters by the 1720s and 1730s. This house has all the features of an English country gentleman's mansion, beautiful grounds and gardens. Inside the house you see a lot of wealth, ornate woodwork, a beautiful ebony staircase. All of these are displays of the Plater family's wealth, who represented a leading family of Maryland. You'll notice in front of the fireplace there are these two stands with discs that can be moved up and down these rods. These are there for the purpose of blocking the heat from hitting the face of women sitting in front of the fire to warm themselves. Women typically wore wax makeup, and if they got too close to the fire, their faces would melt. On the other side of the parlor, you see these windows. These windows date back to the early 1800s, and if you look closely in this window pane, you can see faintly some letters scratched into the windows. It was a tradition of young women of well-to-do families, as they were becoming engaged, to try out their engagement rings to see if they were genuine diamond and not paste by scratching their soon-to-be married names into the window panes. And what we see here are the letters K-E-Y. The bride-to-be of Francis Scott Key scratched these letters into this pane in the early 1800s. Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner that eventually became the national anthem of the United States. So what we see in the Sodderly plantation is an illustration of the kind of wealth that was accumulated by Chesapeake planters by the 1720s and 1730s. They formed an economic and political elite that essentially ruled the South. That's where I just showed you. That's where Hollywood is. And then up the James River, there's today, that's like Plantation Row. You can see the results of this fantastic wealth. I'm going to show you just a few scenes of Shirley Plantation. That was built by Robert King Carter for his sonny boy. It's beautiful. Probably the most impressive of them all. That's where it's situated. It's quite a place. Georgian style, 3 stories high. You can go there and visit it. It's still occupied by descendants of the Carters. Looks like that. And they'll take you around the first floor. Docents will take you around the first floor. And I remember in that structure, there's a great big entryway and foyer. It's like a hallway where they have a gallery of the descendants of Robert King Carter, and I've put in some of their pictures there just to show you what these people look like. Oh, he's a chip off the old block, huh? That's his son. That's one of his descendants. Take a look at his daughters. Chip off the old block. Aha! I learned something. See that line of color there? Traveling painter artists would go from door to door saying, I have a painted body ready to put your head on it. You too can have a personal portrait of yourself. Will you pay me? He said, yes, I will. So put painter head right on top of that body. In the northern colonies, the elites also, people on top emerged. Guys who are so wealthy like this. This is a New England merchant. We were talking about merchants. They rose to the top, acquired great wealth, and were able to pass it on to their kids. This guy obviously had enough wealth, and he's quite proud of himself to have an expensive portrait made of himself. You know, this is the equivalent of looking at the portraits that were made by Renaissance artists of Renaissance princes. You know, in the 1400s or so. This guy is proud of what he does for a living. His name, you don't have to write his name. This is Elijah Boardman. He's showing you where he makes his money. Can you tell what that is? Can you tell what that is? Look at it. He's some kind of merchant. What kind of merchant is he? What do you think those things are? It's a closet full of that stuff. It's fabric. He's a textile merchant. That's fine fabric. New Milford, Connecticut. Yeah. I'll ask one question about this particular topic. the Salem witchcraft trials. Now, so many of you watched cheesy movies associated with this. This is a real phenomenon. It did happen in 1692. It's been called the Salem witchcraft hysteria. Listen, New England didn't invent the fear of witches or the belief in witches. Periodically, Europe was periodically Europe through the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s experienced kind of rages where people would be burned for being witches. This struck Salem, Mass, an old Puritan town, in a very dramatic way. And here's the basic background. You don't have to write this stuff down. It's too much. It helps me tell the story. You must know something about it. There was a Puritan minister, Samuel Harris. He had some daughters. He had a West Indian slave named Tituba, proving that they had slaves. Tituba. She knew voodoo. And the kids played around with that stuff. These girls, outside of adult supervision, stimulated them, excited them. And then at some point they started to demonstrate these convulsions, which they blamed on various people in the community, calling them agents of the devil, and the community believed them. The adults believed them. They bring charges against these people, and they're brought to trial. And ultimately in Salem, 178 people accused of being witches by the authorities, 400 in the entire colony. These trials result in 20 being executed for being witches. One is pressed to death. And ever since that happened, and then it just kind of dies away. Finally, when the girl started accusing the governor's wife of being a witch, he said, "This is crazy. This is crazy." And they let everybody who's still alive out of jail. And it just faded away. Ever since it happened, there have been these attempts by social scientists to explain what it was all about. And here's one. So I'm going to show you here a series of theories. That's all I want you to know. What was a theory and what wasn't. This is actually one. Were those girls tripping out on something like LSD? Well, it sounds silly, but ergo is a fungus that affects rye. LSD is a derivative of ergo. Toxicologists know that eating ergo-contaminated food can give you a bunch of symptoms like violent muscle spasm, vomiting, delusions, hallucinations, crawling sensations, and that's what the girls showed. And the area around Salem was a prime breeding ground for that fungus. So is that possible? That's been thrown out there. It doesn't make sense to me why all the adults, a selective group of adults would have believed this. Now, next other thing, psychological explanations. Well, these girls live very closeted and repressed lives. Was this a way for them to gain power and express themselves? That's possible. Sociological explanations always point out the fact that most of the people who were killed were women. And perhaps this was an unconscious way of the society either targeting people they wanted to get rid of, outcasts, or in the case of women who didn't fit the Puritan mold were unconsciously seen to be witches because they were so unpopular because of their behavior. This is the most promising and convincing explanation right here. Two historians, Boyer and Nissenbaum, went back to Salem and did some basic investigation, and their idea was that Salem was splitting up into two entities, an Old Salem and a New Salem. New Salem was going up socially and economically. Old Salem was going down. And so here's a big map. Boom! A means you're accusers. You've accused somebody of being a witch. W means you've been accused of being a witch. D means you're a defender. Is there a cluster of accusers? Yes. Right here in Old Salem. There's some defenders too, and there's a witch. But on the whole, though, the witches and defenders are over here. So this town is split. This town's split. This side of the town was experiencing economic difficulty, losing its status. This town was going up. Is it possible they transferred their feelings into this kind of religious experience? Possibly. Two questions. Great Awakening. Today's tradition in America regarding religion and government is that the First Amendment guarantees everybody the right to pursue religion the way they want to. And in a public setting like this, I can't favor a person or disfavor a person based on their religious belief. We practice religious pluralism in this state, and there's separation between government and religion. It didn't used to be that way. The Great Awakening is a series of religious revivals that swept through the colonies as preachers went out and threatened people with going to hell for their backsliding, and it caught fire. People were persuaded by this. Before the Great Awakening, most communities had only one church. And in most colonies, they recognized one church, everybody had to pay for it. Anglican Church in the South, Puritan Church in the North. The Great Awakening comes along and it inspires all of this religious fervor. It said, you have to make a connection with God. You have to be emotionally invested. It attracted a very powerful audience. An emotional approach, not a stuffy approach. So a bunch of people became more religious, and more religious denominations got established in the colonies. So you wound up in a situation where there are a bunch of churches now in most communities. This is when the Baptists come to America and the Methodist denomination comes, and the Presbyterian church split into two different entities. The Congregationalist church in some similar way did too. So your typical situation where most communities had a couple of or several churches and no single church dominated. So we believe that this resulted in a situation where people said, government, don't make me pay for one church I don't go to. I'll tell you what, government, you don't tell anybody to pay for any church. Leave it up to the individual. So, and that's the way we are in America today. Religious pluralism carries the day. And with that, you are ready.